go ahead and get started here. So welcome everybody. This is Food Systems Friday, organized by Sustainable Food Systems faculty here at Prescott College. My name is Robin Curry, and I'm the director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program, which is an intentionally online program that seeks to support students in their efforts to build more sustainable food systems in their own communities. Our hometowns need our students as they apply what they're learning in the classroom to improve their food systems. So COVID-19 has definitely put the spotlight on food supply chains, and clearly many of our existing food systems are not equitably ensuring food for all, even in the best of times. For those of you who are less familiar, a food system encompasses all of the stages of keeping us nourished, not just fed, nourished. So it's the growing, the harvesting, the packaging, processing, transforming, the marketing, consuming, and hopefully not too much disposal of food. And none of this occurs in a vacuum. It's all of the other structures around, surrounding our interactions with food. As a faculty, we are thinking about the increased vulnerability to food insecurity that has happened as a result of isolation measures associated with COVID. But we know that even before COVID, people were already vulnerable to food insecurity and the health impacts associated with our political, social, agricultural, and healthcare structures. We recognize food as a human right, and we've also been thinking about how food is racialized. Now, more than ever, we have important work to do to ensure safe and resilient food systems, but the big question is, how do we get this right? The Food Systems Friday series focuses on policies, practices, and people, like our guest who's here with us today, who can show us and help us learn about models of sustainable food systems and sustainable communities. So our guest, Dr. Michelle Perro, will be speaking on the topic of removing politics from the children's menu. And before we dive in, I just want to remind you that we will be back for another episode, but it will be in 3 weeks from now. There's the Labor Day weekend. We figured folks might be enjoying themselves instead of sitting in front of a Zoom presentation. So we'll see you again on September 11th. We'll be airing at exactly the same time. But we'll be bringing in voices from other parts of the planet. Our conversation will focus on the intersection of food security and traditional ecological knowledge from a country recently independent from colonization, and this is Kyrgyzstan, also known as the Kyrgyz Republic. So if you've registered already, you'll get a notification about that in the coming weeks. So by now you're all Zoom pros. We already talked about how you're muted and your camera is off. We are recording this webinar. It's our effort to make all of this available to everyone for free via our website for folks who are unable to attend at this specific time. So I encourage you all to be participating in the chat, but please be aware that we'll capture what is written in the chat and also make that available. So we really do appreciate the ability for us to do this for those who can't be here at this particular time, but please know that we will distribute it. So if you would take a look at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom window, you'll see a little bubble sticking up that says chat. So I would really appreciate if you could take the time now to introduce yourself, say hello, perhaps identify the organization that you're engaged with, especially if you would like to be part of this learning community, and if you're comfortable with having people potentially reach out to you for further information or further collaboration, because that's a shared goal of ours with the webinar series. So please feel free, introduce yourself in the chat, and you're welcome to post questions there in the chat. One of a Prescott College representative will be monitoring the chat at all times, also if you're having technical difficulties. So we'll track for questions and comments. So please take a moment to say hello and introduce yourself. And this is also helpful for our guest speaker, as it helps them calibrate their conversation for the audience. So as I mentioned, we're looking for ideas about how to make sure that we're getting it right for sustainable food systems. And we are focusing not just short-term solutions, but we are looking to improve food security and food system sustainability for the long term. And so the theme here is on transforming food systems for the long-term provision of healthy food for all as a human right. So the United Nations recognizes in aspects of international law that there is a human right to adequate food. And I want to just remind all of us what that means and how that is communicated. So according to the United Nations, the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child alone or in community with others have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food and means for its procurement. The right to adequate food shall therefore not, this is important, not be interpreted in the narrow restrictive sense which equates it with a minimum package of calories, proteins, or other specific nutrients. Now, the committee also considers that the core content of the right to adequate food implies these two following things. And listen up for the first one, especially important for our conversation and topic today with Dr. Perro. The ability of food in a quantity and quality sufficient to satisfy the dietary needs of individuals, free from adverse substances, and acceptable within a given culture. Emphasis on the free from adverse substances. The accessibility of such food in ways that are sustainable and that do not interfere with the enjoyment of other human rights is the second tenet. So this is why we are here today. You are taking time to join us today shows that you care about how the food system is politicized and racialized and how that intersects with the human right to food. Yet we also know that not all of us are sure about how to build accountability into our own work in food systems and also to other actors in the food system. So for those reasons, I invited Dr. Michelle Perro. She's a veteran pediatrician who transformed her clinical practice to include pesticide and health advocacy. She's executive director of a nonprofit scientific-based website, and I'll share that link. It's gmoscience.org. And she's also co-author of the highly acclaimed book, What is Making Our Children Sick? And I think it's really important to include the subtitle in that book. So the full title is What's Making Our Children Sick? How Industrial Food is Causing an Epidemic of Chronic Illness and What Parents and Doctors Can Do About It. You'll find her full bio in the chat in just a minute, and I'm pleased to welcome and hand the mic over to Dr. Michelle Perro. Welcome.
Robin, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, and I just want to sign up for your course and go back and get my master's. I'm like, yeah, this is great. I want to go back to school. So thank you. So yeah, so I'm just thrilled to be talking about getting politics off the menu, along with the chicken fingers and the mac and cheese to go. And so we can start there if you like, Robin, as a jumping off point, or how I got into this cauldron of stuff, because I'm a pediatrician.
I think that's a great place to start. So please.
So I'll share, with the attendees that indeed I am a clinician. I take care of children. That's been my passion. It's still my passion. I've done it for a long time. And what happened was, in my office, I started seeing literally an epidemic. And I don't use that word loosely, especially in this specific time, of kids with chronic diseases. And I thought, scratch, what's going on? I don't like this. What's happening? And, you know, as life is, I feel that I've been blessed with serendipity, not so much, you know, brain power, but more luck. And knocking on my door, I learned through Jeffrey Smith actually, and I read his book called Seeds of Deception. And I learned about GMOs and their associated pesticides. And this was about, I'd say about 15, 18 years ago. And once I learned about that and I started researching the topic, which I did, and investigating scientific research on GMOs and pesticides and the relationship on health, and realizing there were no human studies on the effects of GMOs and pesticides on children's health, or anyone's health for that matter, other than a few lab rats, I started putting the pieces together on what's happening with kids, particularly in terms of gut health and neurologic health, and started a massive effort to change diets. And as people know, conventional physicians know nothing about nutrition. I got 2 hours in medical school. Now, granted, that was a long time ago. I don't think they get much more than that now, perhaps 2 weeks. But it's not the kind of nutritive knowledge that families need to nourish, not feed their families, but nourish their families. And so armed with this new knowledge, I started myself on a massive re-education campaign. I did have a background in integrative medicine by that time. By the way, I started expanding my toolbox, and hence I began to write about and change my practice to include more on organic, regenerative eating. And that's how that all began. Shall I continue?
Yeah, sometimes I'm a little slow on the mute button. You know, I have to wake up my mouse, so forgive
you know, so that's indeed how it started. So, but then the secondary realization, once I made that global discovery, like, oh, food matters. You are what you ate. I started understanding that. It's a little bit of an old concept. Then what happened, I started recognizing, like, well, gee, I was taking care of a complex chronically ill children. I wasn't dealing, you know, with what we call well baby checks or primary care. I was taking care of kids with autism spectrum, with diabetes, with asthma, with obesity, with an immense array of neurocognitive developmental disorders. And those were my people. And then I said, well, gee, I can only see 8, 10 kids in the clinic. There are millions. And so hence I needed to write the book. But I again had another serendipitous encounter with my neighbor, a new neighbor, Dr. Vincent Adams, who's a medical anthropologist at UCSF. And we were hiking as new friends one day. She's an author specifically on Tibetan health, and that's her area of specialty, and share with her my ideas. And we married and wrote the book together. And when we first started, I'll share with the audience, this is important. She was total disbelief of everything I said. The arguments that ensued between us, hiking the trails, I live in Northern California, you know, were vicious. We were at it. And she said, there's no way. So Dr. Adams joined me in my clinic. She interviewed over 20 of my patients with me for the book, which is already a couple of years old. And she said, oh my God. And she did a 180 and then became part of the GMO Concerned Scientist group. And I like to remove that anti word out there. I'm not anti-GMO because there is some genetic engineering in medicine, like insulin is genetically engineered. There are some vaccines that are genetically engineered. There's other, heparin is genetically engineered. So I say it shouldn't be part of our food. There's no role for genetic engineering in food. And that's where she has helped. And I've been on this platform ever since, locally, nationally, and now working at an international level about the actual effects of GMOs and pesticides. You don't need a GMO alone, a genetically engineered food, and what is the impact on health. So that's a very long way of how this all birthed and how I got here.
Yeah, I think I'm sure our audience might be interested in what was that, a couple of those oh my God moments that your co-author had that helped frame the issue for her, and then in your work since then.
There were two aha moments with patients of mine, and one where she was in the room with, she could barely stay in the room because this child had such severe autism, and they came from a growing area of California in the Central Valley, and they're a Latinx family, and Latinx family are disproportionately represented in the sprayed communities because they live in near agriculture, and they are heavily sprayed both at their schools and their homes and with pesticides. So this one boy, and we wrote around the book, and his family came to see me, and of humble means, and lo and behold, they did not eat organic. Their foods were mostly sprayed, and they came mostly processed. They had nutrient poor diets, and I began by shifting his diet. First thing I do now when a kid with autism, Robin, in all fairness, I do a lot of things. I'm just not changing diets, but I am healing the gut from different conditions. They're called intestinal permeability. I am rebalancing the microbiota. I'm restoring nutrient levels. I'm doing a lot of things, but the first thing I do is get the family to go organic. And this took a lot, because let's face it, it's not subsidized. And I know your students and your listeners are well aware of that. So it's expensive. So how we did that, how we worked together, and within 3 days, he showed signs of improvement of going from his traditional diet of a processed GMO entrenched and laced foods and an organic diet. And then mom was serious. And dad was a truck driver. And dad went organic too. And where my co-author and friend got really blown out was dad had end-stage renal disease, which is epidemic right now in Central America. It's called Mesoamerican nephropathy, especially in the cane fields where there are a lot of workers being sprayed. So his family all had end-stage renal disease, kidney disease, and two of his brother and his mom were on dialysis. And the dad, all he did was go organic, and he stopped eating out along his trucker route. He'd be out like for 2 weeks, and he'd bring all his food in a cooler. 8 to 10 months later, I don't remember the exact time, goes to see his nephrologist, his kidney doctor, and he regained 80% of his kidney function. This is a true story. And she said, "Oh my God, what did you do?" And he said, "I switched my diet to organic." And that story rocked my world. That's one of my whoa, even I, who I'd been doing this for a while now, I went, whoa. And my co-author stopped her in her tracks. So that's one very potent story that I'd like to share. And because dialysis is no joke. I mean, it's really a horrific kind of thing to lose your kidney function. So anyway, that's to give you a flavor of the kind of results that I was seeing over the years. So that's sort of, how I was launched into this business. But then something else started happening, Robin, and I'm mostly involved with food. And then I recognized that indeed, these chemical inputs in our food and genetic modified issues and the pesticides were bad, but the toxicant load, which are inorganic materials that people are exposed to, was exorbitant. And kids could no longer handle the toxic load. And I recognized that it was coming from a multiplicity of sources, including the pesticides, including the water, including the air, including the other contaminants, plastics, etc., that the toxic load was overwhelming children's detoxification systems. But no doubt in my mind and in other researchers, I stand amongst many who believe this, is that glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, is responsible for a majority of health issues.
Mm-hmm. I think because we have folks engaged in food systems who come from lots of different disciplinary backgrounds, not everybody may be aware of what some of those impacts of glyphosate are on people. So when you were talking, you mentioned that, children, just their bodies aren't able to handle the toxic load. And so perhaps you could share a little bit more information about, how that manifests itself in our children, and then, specifically what some of the impacts of glyphosate exposure are, especially on children.
Absolutely. So we have various detoxification pathways to help us clear the environmental toxicants, right? Toxins are organic, toxicants are inorganic, like heavy metals. You can have organic toxins too, like bacteria, for example. So the way, so you have two defense systems for toxicants and managing, let's just call it, for sake of simplicity, toxins. So we have two defense systems, and the first one is your microbiome, the microbiota, that collection of organisms that inhabits every part of your being, including, we emit a personal skin microbiota, and if you don't like someone, it may be because you don't like their little microbiome cloud. That is an actual personal identifier. But okay, let's stick to the gut. So in the gut, your microbiota is your first line of defense. Now, there are three major factors that will offset your first microbiome that will help you detoxify. One are cesarean births, where babies don't acquire the mom's vaginal flora, which will then help kind of shape their immune system, called their innate immunity. Number two is lack of breastfeeding, which we can give a couple of hours right there, because through breastfeeding, there is an abundance of substances in breast milk that feed babies' microbiome. They're called human milk oligosaccharides. And there are over 200 types in breast milk. An average mom will have 50. And because of inability to breastfeed, families looking different, adoption, you can fill in the blank. So a lot of people are opting to formula, and formula is not ideal for food, particularly if it's not organic. It has about 15 different additives. Okay, three, if mom is nursing and she's not on an organic diet, she's getting a hefty dose of glyphosate, because it's in everything, literally, if it's not organic. And Roundup is more toxic than glyphosate, by the way, amongst at least 6 pesticides, or in the average food is probably more. And what we know about glyphosate-based herbicides is that they're antibiotics. So these antibiotics are altering baby's microbiota, those germs in the baby's gut. And because of this offset microbiota, they have impaired detoxification, they don't produce certain vitamins, and they can develop leaky gut. The second line of defense is your liver. Your liver is your major detox organ, the big organ. And now we have a big problem with the liver happening in the US. It's actually worldwide. It's happening even in the continent of Africa as well. It's not just the US problem now. We've imported our food technology to other countries, unfortunately. So 1 in 3 Americans now has something called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that liver issue was previously, linked to alcoholism, high cholesterol, obesity, etc. But many folks who have this NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, including children, there's no etiology. They say unknown etiology. Well, many authors now, especially the American Liver Foundation, saying, wait, it's the high fructose corn syrup that's causing this liver epidemic of fatty liver, which can progress to worsening liver disease. So where does high fructose corn syrup come from? Corn, genetically modified corn. How much of that is impacting the liver? It's pretty clear we know. We know that GMOs themselves, without pesticides, impact. They reduce, they cause oxidative stress, they reduce oxidants, antioxidants like glutathione. We know that 0.1 parts per billion, super low dose of glyphosate-based herbicides causes, not correlate, cause with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So now we're impairing baby's liver. Children with obesity, 1/3 of them not only have NAFLD, they've gone on to have NASH, which is a more serious sequelae called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So now you have children with impairments of their gut, of their liver, and again, and some kids even have enzyme issues, and and they don't have certain enzymes that can break down pesticides, called PON1. And babies have very low levels of this enzyme. It's a field of nutrigenomics, which I'm very interested, that there's some of us who should be eating, based on our genomics, a certain kind of diet. But again, that's another Friday session, Robin. We'll shelve that. So you have some kids who don't have these enzymes. Dr. Brenda Eskenazi has been studying this in the Salinas Valley of California, a growing area, for 19 years, called the Chamaco study. And if your attendees aren't familiar with that, please look at her group's work. It's not just Dr. Eskenazi and others who have been looking at and following these children and now adults, and particularly with a look at organophosphates, type of chlorpyrifos, and other nasty pesticides, and the outcomes are pretty concerning. So we've known about this stuff, and I think she's one of the first ones who wrote about this enzyme issue, although it's been known since the 50s. So now this is what's happening to our children. I know I'm kind of getting into the science and the medicine a bit, but I think it's important for people, especially in whether you're a chef, you're a dietitian, you're, going into food politics, to understand that we have a sea of chronically ill children. 1 out of 2, 54% of American children have a chronic disease. And if we don't look at the food system, that this will continue. This is continuing an upward trend. Even since I wrote that book, numbers have trended upward, Robin. So that's why I think, yes, I'm a bit wordy here, and I apologize for, my soliloquy on the soapbox, but this is why it's so important to understand this effect of what we've done to create this industrialized food-like substance that our families are eating.
No, I asked the question. So, you're right on right on topic, and I think there was a lot in there, and I want to remind everybody that you're welcome to ask clarifying questions, or if questions are coming up for you based on what Dr. Perro is saying, please put them in the chat, or you'll also notice that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen next to your chat box. So please feel free, either location, and we can put the question directly to Dr. Perro to move the conversation forward. So there was a lot in there, and I think one of the things that you mentioned that I think people would be interested in learning more about is, your comments about breast milk. But before we transition into that direction, which is effectively a disproportionate exposure of environmental toxins to the youngest and least developed in terms of their ability to tolerate them, there is a question from somebody in the audience. And so the question is, how do you separate the effects of GMOs / pesticides from the effects of unhealthy food in general? So there's a follow-up part to it. So I'll read the for example, and then I'll repeat the first part of the question. So for example, how do you know it was going organic that helped the truck driver versus just switching from eating out to packing more healthy foods? How do you know it's GMOs, pesticides, causing fatty liver disease rather than the sugar? So the original question was, how do you separate the effects of GMOs, pesticides from the effects of unhealthy food in general?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't always know. It's a good question, and I don't always know. So if you're eating processed foods, 85% of processed foods contain GMO ingredients, because the main ingredient is soy lecithin. And in the US right now, I think soy is about probably, in the US, the crop's about 95% GMO right now. And if you eat a GMO, it is sprayed. That's called herbicide tolerance. And because of weed resistance, the amount of herbicide that has to be sprayed has gone up. And not only has the amount of glyphosate-based herbicides gone up, they've had to bring in more complex and more layered pesticides like 2,4-D and dicamba, which are causing a mess, so more pesticides. So if you're eating that stuff, you are eating GMOs and pesticides. Processed foods themselves contain those elements. So if you're eating just organic processed foods, that would be the study to conduct. So I can tell you, I based a lot of my knowledge based on the Nantes French study. They looked at over 100,000 French participants in a study published 2 years ago, maybe. And they found that for the people who completed, it was a survey, which is, not the best way to study, but it's hard to do food studies in general and control what people are eating. It's very difficult to do. They analyzed, I think it was 112,000 people, which is massive amount of data. And for those people who had an organic diet, the rate of cancer was so much lower, particularly breast, cancer and some other cancers, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, was much lower in those individuals who ate organic. And so another study just came out a couple of weeks ago that for families, there were 6 families followed. For those who switched to organic, within, I believe it was 7 days, the pesticide levels went away. We're just going organic. So we know it removes. So we also know the effects on health of pesticides. I mean, there's so much data on the effect of pesticides, and all pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, and herbicides. And that data is well established in the literature. GMOs themselves, we don't eat them alone, but there are very few studies just looking at GMOs on the effect of health. I actually only found like 3 or 4 because you eat them in combination. You just don't eat a GMO. So whether it's an effect of just a GMO, it's really a moot point because you don't eat them alone. So then to the listener who asked that really good question, so I've treated now hundreds of families switching their diet. And I've seen similar results, improvement, improvement, improvement. And not just my patients, the families. Because when I switch a diet of a family, everyone has to switch. So, you know, little Johnny can't eat kale salad and everybody else is eating takeout pizza. Doesn't work that way. So switch the whole family, and the changes are pretty shocking. And sometimes from switching from their traditional diet, which may have some organics in it, to an all organic diet, for some members of families, I saw improvements within 3 days. Most kids, it takes longer, about 4 weeks, before you see a significant change. Because if you have inflammation, it takes weeks for those antibodies that cause inflammation go away. It's very individualized, very independent. So I started doing this, and as a physician, I see 1 case of diarrhea, I see 3, I see 70, I see 300. I can treat diarrhea pretty easily. In case of food and GMO pesticide issues, I see 1 kid, I see 5, I've seen 7, I've seen 70. By now, at this juncture in my career, I've been doing it like 18 years, I've seen a few thousand. And I'd say the majority got better. And this is called anecdotal medicine, right? This because I'm not studied, but this is a huge value. It's not empirical. I didn't do a controlled study, but it was just mind-blowing. In my hundreds and hundreds of case reports of families who've gotten better when they change their diet. Yes, indeed, you are removing the high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is loaded with mercury. So you're lowering their heavy metal levels. Yes, indeed, you're lowering some of their trans fats. Trans fats are toxic, and they oxidize. They're not healthy. So you're giving a more nutrient enriched food. So you're giving them more magnesium, more zinc, more B vitamins, selenium, etc. So you are doing a lot of different things when you change your diets, because organic food has a higher nutrient level. I think it's 20% higher than conventionally grown food. So you are increasing their nutrient levels at the same time. So if you were to say, how do you know exactly? I don't. But after so many anecdotes, I'd say I'm pretty convinced that these changes improve health outcomes. And so it's based on a lot of my clinical experience with those studies that I mentioned. It's the Nutri-Nantes study out of France, by the way. And Robin, if anybody wants that study, I'm happy to provide the link for you as well.
Great. That'd be great. I'm sure folks will.
Yeah.
We have a related question here. And so the question is coming from Sharon Palmer, and she's a faculty member with us here at Prescott College. I was mentioning her when we were speaking at the beginning. Yeah. So she's also known as the plant-powered dietitian. And she asks, she says, I'd love to hear your take on pesticides, especially as it relates to EPA's regulation. So there's a little more information. The messages we are getting is that the established thresholds are safe and tolerable. The dose makes the poison. How do we counter this argument?
Yes, indeed, Sharon. Oh gosh, when in January of 2020, the EPA came out with its recommendation that the IARC which is the arm of the World Health Organization that published in 2015 of March that glyphosate was a carcinogen, a class 2A carcinogen, meaning a carcinogen in animals, but not humans, but human studies weren't done. And so that caused a fury of dissent, right? And even in California, in my state, we labeled it Prop 37, Prop 65, pardon, that carcinogen, that glyphosate is a carcinogen, which was recently challenged in federal courts that we can do that. So in January, the EPA, in their wisdom, they are a shell of an organization, unfortunately, and they've lost their original power, which was started in the 1970s, basically came out and said glyphosate is not linked to cancer, and that the levels that would keep rising because we keep using more are acceptable. And they're acceptable in babies as well, based on no data. So I was outraged because, as you said, dose does not make the poison. That regulatory agencies are basing these arbitrary levels of ADI and the amount of daily intake that we can tolerate. I think it's 1.75 milligrams per kilo of glyphosate, which is based on a 60-kilo human and not a 5-kilo baby. Anyway, that aside, I'll leave my sarcasm at the door for a second. So looking at this, reckon this dose doesn't make the poison because we know that ultra low doses of glyphosate, for example, have an inverse curve at the relationship at the bottom of the curve, meaning as you go to very low doses of glyphosate, the curve goes up. It has endocrine effects at extremely low doses of glyphosate. And for what I mentioned prior, out of this study that I was quoting, it was from King's College, Dr. Michael Antonio and his group. He's the head of gene expression and gene therapy. He published with his group that doses as low as 0.1 parts per billion caused the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And that is way lower than anything we're exposed to here in America. So this idea of dose poison, out the door. And we know that, and I know, Sharon, you know that as well. So regulatory agencies, the EPA, the USDA, the FDA are not protecting us. They're not looking out for our welfare. We can talk about what happens when industry infiltrates regulatory agencies, which is what's happened in the case of the US, and that children are no longer being protected. Trump, in his wisdom, released a pediatrician several years ago who was looking out for children's health from the EPA. So as my understanding now, it's just a shell organization. And I really don't put any faith in what the EPA has to say right now. So, you know, that therefore, myself as a pediatrician, a clinician, frontline pediatrician, I have to understand the political milieu, the political menu, so to speak, and back to the title of our talk, to understand how to treat people. Because now I'm not just treating a kid in my clinic, I'm looking at EPA data. Who's telling families like, Dr. Perro, what the heck are you talking about? The EPA says it's fine and you're saying it's not. Why should we believe you? Valid point. Why should family believe me over the EPA? I say, okay, excellent point. That's what I tell families. Can you and your family do an experiment for me? Can you go organic for 4 weeks? And I mean really organic, like everything organic. For 4 weeks and just report back how you feel. And if you feel no different, case rested. But if you notice in your N of 4, 5, 6 people in your family, 3, whatever you are, including Fido and the cat, include everybody because cats and dogs have tremendous health challenges right now. I can give you dog statistics that will make your hair gray. It made my hair gray. Well, nature helped a little bit, not so gray. But I said to myself, wow, families have to see this themselves. They come back and they go, oh my God, my skin cleared, my headaches went away, my mood is better, my kid's bloated tummy and is better, he's pooping now. These are the kind of things I heard back. And so these are some of our challenges. I kind of digress off the EPA question, but there's the EPA and then there's the clinic. And so I hope I answered, Sharon, your question.
I think you did. I'll leave it to Sharon to ask a follow-up. If yes, she said, thanks for your response. And you know, for those of you, I'd encourage you to check out the chat, because there's some additional information that Sharon shared. And she notes the HEN DPG, which is the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Dietary Practice Group, or Dietetics Practice Group. I'll need Sharon to type it in there to make sure that I get it right. But I know my HENs because they're wonderful allies in supporting sustainable food systems amongst registered dietitians. So dietetic practice group. So thank you, Sharon. And I think you may have addressed in your comments just now, Michelle, a question that Ignacio had, and that was, what parameters do you usually measure to assess the benefits you observe after starting an organic diet? So please feel free to add if there's something else that you'd like to add, but you know, you gave a nice long list about families.
Yeah, so I think people need to be given more credit, and families need to be given more credit, and parents, that you can observe yourself change in your own children, your own pets, if you don't have children, when you go to an organic diet. And I'm going to tell you what they are, because this is what comes out on a physical exam when you examine children. Children who have a nutrient poor, highly processed foods diet, like most American children, this is what you'll notice. And please go back and examine your own children, just your own, no other children, please. The hair is coarse. The skin may be dry or oily. They have little bumps on their skin. It's a form of eczema. It's called hyperkeratosis pilaris. You're going to see dark circles under the children's eyes. If you look at the kids' tongues, you'll see swollen tongues with little ridges on the sides. If you look at their nails, you'll see these horizontal ridges on their nails that signify nutrient deficiencies. You'll see also kids with poor muscular tone, which could also be from glyphosate, and I can go on a little bit with how we think that happens. And you'll see kids, which could also be from tech overload and being COVIDized. I don't know, no one's out playing, but okay. And also, you'll also see premature puberty, where boys have gynecomastia, which is the development of breast. You'll see girls with premature, and boys with premature pubarch, where they're going into menstruation early and sexual development early. So we now have middle schoolers who are sexually developed. Nightmare for middle school, right? You can imagine 12-year-old boys and 10-year-old girls in puberty, right? With no frontal lobe, no abstract thinking. And you'll see these kids with kind of roundish looking tummies, obesity, now affecting 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 children, depending on what state you're from. So these are what our kids looking like. When you start to change their diets, and this does not happen overnight, I don't want to be overly naive or simplistic here. It takes a few months to see these changes. Your kids look healthier. Hair, nails, tongue, energy levels, dark circles get better, et cetera, et cetera. So you can witness these changes in your own families when you start to make these changes and give more nutrients. And as a matter of fact, you know, I'm not a big supplement queen in the past, but now I highly recommend that children need a multivitamin, which is crazy for families who are, again, jeopardized because of no income, COVID, food security issues. I don't think there's enough nutrients, even in organic food, because of what we've done to the soil. So now I'm having families. I set up a program in my own kids' school called Farming Fridays. You know, so Farming Fridays, where kids learn to farm. Healthy soil, healthy tummy. And we make those parallel, actually not parallel, but related metaphor between the tummy being like soil, and it has to be enriched. And that basic math is soil health equals tummy health. And that's one of the concepts we teach kids in getting their hands dirty, getting the microbes. Soil is alive. It's not dirt, it's alive. And we talk about regenerative soil, climate change, all those related topics I'm sure your guests have spoken to, and why this is so important. So one of the big pushes I have, and which I think is an amazing benefit of COVID-19, is a lot of families have started to grow their own. And have started, and seeds were like the #1 thing being sold in America during these past few months. And so I hope we can turn, you know, lemonade from lemons, and we can begin to embrace children getting back into the soil, embracing it. And so this was a bit of a long answer, but these changes can be seen in families, and you don't need to be a physician to see them yourself. Parents know their own children very well.
Yeah, thank you. We had another question, because you've been talking about some different kind of categories, broad categories of foods. And so there's organic, but then there's also the processed food, and there can be organic processed foods. And so the question that's coming from the audience, this is from Isaiah Ruffin. He asks, how do you define processed foods?
So, it's not to say, just because something is organic is necessarily healthy. Processed food means that you take a substance, whether it's corn, and you process it into tortilla chips, which I happen to enjoy, but that whole process is processed, even if they're organic chips. So indeed, those organic chips are better than the non-organic chips, which are GMO chips, but it's still not a health food. Okay, so those kind of foods I'm recommending in small amounts. Now, most of us are not going to go out and create rice patties outside in our backyard. Like certain foods we're going to have to eat processed, like rice, which is, again, not a health food either, by the way, but tastes good and kids like it because it's carbs and it's yummy. So those foods, certain foods we're going to have to eat processed, like rice, for example. However, what I'm trying to get families to do in our mindset is to shift to more fruits and veggies. I should say veggies, fruits, veggies, and then veggies, because they have everything you need. They're complete foods, and they feed your microbiota. What we're learning now about the microbiome is it's not so important about taking probiotics. It's about taking prebiotics to feed the microbiota. Prebiotics are veggies. Fruits, sure, kids love fruits. You can be plant-based, you can be meat-based. I won't go into whether you should follow a plant-based or meat-based diet. I say avoid all foods. I don't support in any way impossible anything in these pseudo meat plant-based food like foods. Those are technocratic patents that I think are just Silicon Valley profiteering from creating patents on food, but we can go into that if you like. And so eating organic, getting everyone in the kitchen. I know some people say we should be saying regenerative ag and organic ag. For the sake of simplicity, I just say organic. People understand that if it's organic, it doesn't have GMOs or pesticides. That's by definition. And getting people cooking, people preparing. And I say people, I didn't say mom. We want to leave that stereotype behind about 5 decades ago. And children can cook, and they love knives, and children love chopping. So this idea of getting kids back in the kitchen, making their own lunches, making their own breakfast, helping them prepare dinner, we have to start that. And nobody gets a pass. Boys, girls, grandpa, everybody in the kitchen. So this is where we have to get back to. And I, hey, I like eating in restaurants too, but until restaurants change their menu, I say no. And if they're not using organics, I don't want to eat any restaurant nasty or canola oil that they use 100 times, which is loaded with trans fats in it. No, I want to support the restaurants that support this mindset. And we have to encourage and support those restaurants in our own areas. Who doesn't like to eat out sometimes and not cook? Everybody. But what I talk to my parents about, because a lot of my patients are gluten-free or dairy-free or both, and even soy-free, is communal food sharing. That families who have kids on similar diets, many kids on the spectrum, for example, I'd make them gluten and dairy-free. That's a long story. That why can't we share? Why does everyone have to cook individually at night? Why can't 3 families get together, bring a tray of food over and just share the trays if we're cooking organic in a similar way? To create, and we're all home now. Many of us are home, working from home. We are. So my family has embraced cooking together more, sharing with our neighbors, sharing with friends. So building community around prepared food. And this is where I want to get back to. And you don't have to be Julia Child to do this. Even my daughter, she's a big organic farmer, and I was learning how to ferment. And I said to my daughter, how do I ferment, honey? And she's in her 20s, and she said, Mom, YouTube it. Cheese. I YouTubed it, and oh, there was fermenting. It was really easy. And I encourage a lot of fermented foods in people's diets. Even my chickens get a little apple cider vinegar every day in their water. Apple cider vinegar is one of the best things you can do to offset glyphosate, by the way, as well as sauerkraut. I just have to throw a few tips out there for the attendees. So I hope, Ignacio, did I answer your question? I hope I covered it.
Yeah, well, we'll keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah,
and
keep an eye on the chat box.
Follow up.
Yeah.
Now there is there's another question. This is coming from Karen, as noted there, and so I'm going to try. This is stretching my Zoom boundaries a little bit, with the raise hand, because I think it allows the person to talk. Thank you for bearing with us as we experiment here. So if you're ready to go, I'm clicking allow to talk now. So you are on. You'll just have to unmute yourself, whoever Karen is.
Oh, hi. I think that I didn't even mean to do that. I think my I hit the button, but since I get, but I've been really appreciating this. And actually, I'm curious about the apple cider vinegar comment you did just say about counteracting glyphosate, because that's and sauerkraut, because I think I'm a big fan of ferments, and I teach children how to make fermented pickles and things like that. So yeah, I'd love to be able to give them more information about how that can help with those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
thanks for being a good sport. As I put you on the spot there, we're both learning how to raise hands.
Thank you. I kind of like Karen. Thank you, Karen, for the question, and thank you for what you're doing. All behind that. So where I first got into this, I have a fabulous farmer friend in Northwest Iowa. His name is Howard Vlieger, and Howard is a crop advisor, organic farmer in a sea of like GMO soy. I don't know how he talks, and corn. But anyway, so Howard, we've been working on this journey together for a very long time. There are a lot of us in the GMO concerned scientists, farmers movement, many of us, and we're in community, by the way. And Howard alerted me to a study about how cows were doing better because cows were receiving a lot of glyphosate, not just from their feed when they're getting this soy-based feed and corn-based feed, not good for cows, but in their bedding. It was actually being sprayed. So glyphosate-based herbicides are used as desiccants off-label to quicken crop development and the levels of glyphosate are extremely high. And so cows are suffering this massive diseases right now called cow wasting disease in America. Livestock loss is a huge problem. Okay, that was a little aside. So I read about humic acid and apple cider vinegar and some other things in livestock. I'm like, well, gee, well, we're not ruminants. We don't have 4 stomachs, but gee, if it's good for cows, it might be good for us. So I started doing some data. I saw that how apple cider vinegar promoted a type of microbe in your gut called Acetobacter, which was really helpful in breaking down glyphosate. And same thing with sauerkraut juice. And I have to dig up the paper, Karen. It's not, I can't get the reference at the tip of my fingers, but I'll go dig it out somewhere. And so I started recommending it because apple cider vinegar is so affordable. It's easy to drink. You can I make a drink in the morning. I just drink it straight, but you can put some lemon juice, water, apple cider vinegar, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of salt in a glass of water in the morning. Super healthy. Your gut will bless you. And so that's how that all came from. And it promotes certain microbes. So fermented foods promote and support the health of the microbiota, or microbiome is synonymous. So whatever you can do to support microbial health is how we should be eating. And that's what I'm teaching families as well. And I'm a big fan of ferments, whether it's I've got apple cider vinegar cooking right now in my own kitchen, whether it's in the form of kombucha, kimchi, sauerkraut, pickles, etc. And you can ferment anything, and kids like fermented fruits. So this is where that came from. And I tell, especially kids on the spectrum, I have a lot of those families give their kids a little bit of sauerkraut juice because it's a kind of an acquired taste, like a nice wine, another favorite fermented drink, not for your children. And so having them introduce the juice in their food.
And for those of you who are interested, as I am, in traditional ecological knowledge and traditional diets, even here in the United States, it was popular in the colonial era, which there were lots of things wrong with the colonial era, but to drink a drink that they called the quote unquote shrubs. And so shrubs are essentially a soft drink that you mix vinegared syrup with water or later carbonated water, and you can choose to put alcohol in it or not. They're making a little bit of a resurgence with more focus on the mixology side of things and the alcohol focus, but these were, just a regular beverage with one step on from your sweetened syrups that you would use to sweeten your drinks, but it would go to the vinegar stage, and that was actually a preferred beverage of the era. So there are some good traditions, food and dietary traditions that sometimes we forget about and we lose out of our dietary systems, and they really need to be put back in. So forgive the aside, but it's one of those great moments to reflect on traditional knowledge and traditional diets, and even what we've lost within the United States in a short time. There's lots of questions, additional questions here. So, but I do want to note for folks, we are getting close towards the top of the hour, and I do have a couple other questions that I would also like to ask Dr. Perro. So I'll go ahead and ask the two questions that I have already, and Dr. Perro has agreed to stay with us until 15 minutes after the hour. So if you have to leave, then check out the recording. You'll get the recording emailed directly to you. But if you can stay, I invite you to stay because I'd like to speak a little bit about some of the advocacy work that Dr. Perro is doing internationally around, supporting, developing countries in holding their ground against some of the pressures to move towards the use of more chemical inputs and the use of GMO improved crops in their production system. So that's what's to come. But I would like to go ahead and ask the other two questions that have already been submitted. So one of the questions is, I'm curious why becoming dairy-free and gluten-free might help those with certain developmental disabilities such as autism.
Mm-hmm. So once you disrupt the microbiota and the microbiome the ways we talked about, you also have a microbiota that lines your intestinal lining. And the intestinal lining is only one cell thick. It's called the epithelium. And when that is disrupted, either via a change in the microbiota and those protective organisms, or by insulting agents which can directly affect the layer of your gut, such as PPIs, those are drugs that decrease acid production. They're called proton pump inhibitors that everyone in America seems to be on these days. That then what happens is that the barrier between your intestinal lining and your bloodstream becomes leaky, and we call it intestinal permeability. And so what happens is if the intestinal lining is permeable and allowing things to pass through before they're completely digested, such as gluten or dairy, that these incomplete broken down proteins called casomorphins or gluteomorphins can get into your bloodstream, and several things can happen. Number one is your immune system, which is sitting on the other side, it's right there in hypervigilant mode, recognizes these as foreign invaders. They mount an immune response, and you develop something called inflammation, and that's where inflammation comes. Additionally, what happens to these large proteins is they're circulating, and one of the places they circulate is right to your blood-brain barrier. When these substances can cross, among other substances, your blood-brain barrier, which is not like a wall surrounding your brain, it's quite permeable, and other things, and glyphosate can shuttle aluminum across your blood-brain barrier in 6 different ways, by the way. And so it activates these cells in your brain, your immune cells in your brain called microglial cells. So when these microglial cells are activated, they cause brain inflammation, hence the term this gut brain. There is a conduit, a pathway, and it's between the bloodstream and the vagus nerve, the wandering longest nerve in your body that goes right up into your head. And you've got these various chemicals. Remember, food is information. Food are chemicals. They're molecules that are now activating inflammatory cells in the brain and causing brain inflammation. It appears that when we remove these foods, about 90% of children on the spectrum have gut issues, by the way. And I have another study about that. When you remove these large proteins, which are also act as endorphin-like substances, casomorphins, gluteomorphins, and they can change your brain chemistry. When you remove those diets, it decreases the brain inflammation, takes time, the gut inflammation, as we're healing the leaky gut. So we're doing a lot of things when we treat kids on the spectrum, and I don't want to shortcut this answer or make it too glib or too easy. It's not easy. It takes time. Those of us who have treated kids on the spectrum do this, and there are many ways to do it. But one of the key elements is removing the inflammatory foods. As a matter of fact, I really do big dietary overhauls with kids with neurocognitive challenges. And we've known, for example, since the 1970s with Dr. Feingold, that kids, for example, with seizures did very well on keto diets and reverse seizure disorders. So we've known a long time that when you change certain food, macromolecules and micromolecules in food, that it affects brain. And so I do a lot of that. And that is, just to give you a kind of quick answer, but this is a big conversation. And this is what I really focus on, because one of the things I'm shocked about most, because you can see I'm very passionate about what I do, is autism. The rates of autism right now are affecting 1 in 23 boys, 1 in 58 kids. And when I was a young buck at Bellevue Hospital, New York, it was 1 in, I think, 8,000. So that is in my lifetime of what I've seen the change of these disorders. So I hope I answered your question there.
I'll let them type if they've got a follow-up or
You've got a follow-up, sure. Hope I answered it.
Now, oh, no, it said, thank you. So got it. And the last question that I had in the queue before we speak to some of the work that you're doing with GMO science is from Richie. And the question is, considering the blossoming popularity of quote unquote, plant-based meats, what knock-on effects do you expect with the replacement of animal pastures with, in parentheses, potentially non-organic monocropping? So I'm reading into it a little bit, if there's a increased demand for the ingredient base for the plant-based foods.
So yeah, this is a big conversation too as well, Robin, because, and thank you for that question, Richie. So indeed, these plant-based foods like the Impossible Burger, for example, come from genetically modified soy. That's where they're coming from. So it's, yes, you're a plant-based diet and you're not giving meat-based, and do people just want the flavor of meat and they don't care the source of the, animals are just sort of a substitute for a technological discovery, a gene editing discovery. So, if we continue with these plant-based foods, especially like the Impossible Burger, they have 14 patents out presently. They have 100 more in the pipeline for these food-like substances, what I call iFoods, that they will increase the switch over from cattle-based meat, and there's an argument made for the benefits of cattle and what they do to soil, etc., to monocropping, and that is another concern. They require a lot of resources. These plant-based foods, it's not the same as eating a black bean veggie burger, which takes about 15 minutes to make. So I mean, I don't really get the whole iBurger thing, but so it supports monocropping and destruction of, and I think cattle do serve a tremendous farm raised, pasture raised, grain-free cattle, humanely treated. I don't want to speak to whether you should be a vegetarian or a vegan or a meat-based person. That we could have many discussions about that, but I think there is a role that cattle do play in supporting the soil, especially when you rotate them. and do it in a very healthy way and support our cattle with love. And that's, of course, as a, an animal lover, I support that. So yes, these I foods support monocropping and GMOs and pesticides.
Thank you. I think that took care of most of the questions that were in the queue. And I just wanted folks to learn a little bit more about other dimensions of the work that you do. And so when we were speaking a couple of weeks ago, I learned about some of your recent work to support communities in Bolivia. And so I wondered if you just might share a little bit about how, you're contributing in that manner also.
Absolutely. And so right now, agribusiness is pushing hard and knocking on pristine landscapes like Bolivia, where they have some of the most gorgeous heirloom seeds. And I mean, they're the king of corn, maize, in Bolivia. And so right now, they're a group of activists, young activists, fighting from many different countries. And I was working with one group called Yo Soy Maíz, and working with them and other groups, and the Plataforma de Bolivia Libre is another one. And the Bolivian government wants to push through without question just GMO processing with no government oversight. And they have these two decretos, which are what we would call propositions, I guess, that they're trying to push through onto the people. There is very little information in Spanish. And these people are just starving, literally, for information. And so myself and a group of other scientists, I created an organization called SAGE, Scientific Alliance on Genetic Engineering. We've band together. We wrote a very strong letter explaining what is happening here in the US as well as other countries, and telling them to hold off before. Once you introduce the GMO crops into Bolivia, they will ruin their pristine crops, because GMO crops just don't stay in their little allotted fields. They cross-contaminate. As a matter of fact, in the US, I think if 5 to 9% of our organics are contaminated with GMOs through wind, birds, human error, etc. So that's one project. And the other project, the textbook, is about to come out pretty soon. I wrote a chapter for it on the effect of pesticides on children in Africa. And Africa is a big place. There's 54 countries in Africa, but there is a massive push to steer them away from their regenerative ag, is where they want to go, to big agribusiness kind of usurping their food models. And that is another conversation. I'm concerned about the African children as well. And so this is a big issue. This is a global issue. I mean, we're talking locally about the kid in the clinic, the kid in my area, the kid in the US. It's a global stage that we have to halt this massive assault of genetically engineered, unmonitored, unstudied, and toxic foods. And once you release them, like the GMO mosquito was just released on August 18th, we can't bring it back. It becomes soaking into our landscape. And not only does it incorporate into our organic foods, but it incorporates in our microbiota. And I can talk about how our own microbes are incorporating GMOs via plasmids into our own microbes. So it's a massive problem from every level: the microscopic, the microbiologic, national, international playing fields, microbial to macrobiologic.
Yeah, thank you. I think, could you please repeat the SAGE, the components of the acronym, so I can get that into the chat for folks?
So myself and some other scientists, I created, it's called Scientific Alliance on Genetic Engineering. And right now, it's GMO 2.0. There's a massive push by industry to release genetically engineered mosquitoes, foods, medicines, etc., because you cannot patent an almond, but you can patent a genetically engineered variant of whatever it is you're looking to patent. And so there are many of us. Jonathan Latham, he's out in Ithaca. My friends over in London, Michael Antonio, and friends, Gilles Seralini. Jeffrey Smith has videos on Institute for Responsible Technology. He has a great interview with Dr. Jonathan Latham on the issues regarding gene editing. And I have a YouTube channel for GMO science, and I have put up little vignettes of videos, especially geared for people with shorter attention spans, shorter videos, like my children. No, I'm just kidding. Millennials sometimes, shorter attention span, about the dangers of gene editing. And I'm right in the process right now of creating a student manual on genetic engineering. And I have a great PowerPoint up about what genetic engineering is on my YouTube channel by Dr. Michael Antoniou. And it really simplifies gene editing. That stuff is so scary of this process, and it's irreversible. We are now eating some gene edited foods like the innate potato, the Arctic apple, and because we don't have GMO labeling, we don't know that Arctic apple, most Americans will not know that innate potato is a gene edited potato. Health risk, not studied.
So maybe this is a great transition point. You know, you're speaking to, for those of you who don't know, I've studied apples, and I've studied apples in their center of origin, which is in Central Asia. So the people of Central Asia are curator for many of the original, germplasm, the original wild crop relatives for a lot of our plant-based foods that grow in temperate climates. So you got me on the apple. But I think this is a great time, for a final question from me here, because I think that those watching today might be wondering, kind of how they can help support the work of pediatricians and other doctors that care about, all these issues that you care about, and, maybe even how they could support your organization's work.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question to wrap up with, Robin. And I really enjoy speaking about this. I care so deeply about this topic. So individuals, change at home. Change begins with us. So change their own home food environments. Pick your cause. We can't battle on all fronts. I've picked food. There are many things I'm concerned about with children's health, just name it. But I have to stay focused on food because that's what I'm passionate about. And that's where I think we eat a lot. Babies eat like 8 times a day. So we eat a lot. That's where we can go. So we start there. Support the organizations that are doing this work, GMO Science, GM Watch. There are many of us, Organic Consumers Association, Ronnie Cummings, Jeffrey Smith, etc. So support your organizations whichever way you can. It may not necessarily be money, it could be in time and in projects. Because right now, for example, I could use some student help at GMO Science in writing content, because I am the main content generator. And maybe folks want to hear another opinion other than my opinion, but sometimes it's really hard to kind of rope people in to get to write pieces and guest blogs, which I just put a guest blog up. So support like our organizations. There's a big study going on now. There are many studies going on, but one is called the Heartland Study. And it's a study that I'm an advisor for, Chuck Benbrook. He's a plant biologist. He's one of the, I think the founders of the study and key investigators. And we're looking at, in the Midwest, the effect of pesticides before, during, and after pregnancy, and we're following 2,000 mother-infant pairs. Because right now, the health stats out of the Midwest on fertility and pesticides effect on fertility are pretty scary. So that's called the Heartland Study. And so this is what I say to folks. At the time where we can be, being quiet is complicit, we can no longer do that. So we have to speak up in whatever way we can. There are many ways to speak up, and this is not about food shaming. And changing our own diets and our families is the way to start. Because I have families and friends who say, I'm all organic. And when I go to their homes, and they're not all organic. And there are things that people forget. Beer and wine, for example, which our sales are up right now during COVID, are massively contaminated. In California, if you don't drink an organic wine, it's 100% contaminated with pesticides. Beer, in certain areas, they can't get the beer to grow because of pesticides affecting the yeast. So when I say organic, I mean really organic, and educating all of us on how to make that happen. And here I am, pediatrician, talking about alcohol, but yeah, I like a nice Cabernet, you know, at the end of a long day. Lovely. So I say do what we can, step in, get involved with organizations, educate yourselves, educate your families, support us, people. And we're all like these little nonprofits, myself, GM Watch, you know, sitting in our little offices, and without my kids who give me IT support, I would really be in deep doo-doo. That's a pediatric word. So, you know, we need help because we're all a bunch of really little organizations. And in GMO Science, I'm running it from right where you see. This is my little GMO Science world with guests, of course, and visitors, and we have a staff. But so we're all small. And so support the nonprofit world and create economic tipping point, because when big agri and companies see the trends toward organic, which is happening, by the way, they shift, because we know it works in America. We are profit driven. So these are the things that we can do.
Thank you. I think you've got you've got folks with a big long to-do list, and and also you have folks admiring the ski guy on the bookshelf.
My husband, who's also a doctor, somebody made that when he graduated medical school. As you can see, my husband, who's from Vermont, enjoyed skiing. I know, Robin, you have ties to Vermont as well. Yes.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, Dr. Perro, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. I think, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat at all, because it can get busy in there, but, words of appreciation coming from those who joined us today. And, I want to echo those and magnify those words of appreciation. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us, and providing people with so many, new threads to pull on as we keep trying to figure out how to unravel the food system for better outcomes for our kids and for ourselves and for our futures. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Robin. My pleasure. Great audience, great questions. And if you need me and somebody has a brain blip and they have to get something answered, Robin, track me down. I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards. Not a problem.
Okay, great. So I also got from Ignacio asking for information where to contact to collaborate. And so, two things here. So Ignacio, one thing is you can always, reach out to me as a hub, and I can get you in touch with Michelle. Also, we will be posting this chat on our website. So it's part of why it's helpful to have folks introduce themselves with their organizations, because then you can get a name and you can track folks down in LinkedIn. And then I will just share, I'm toying with an idea, for all those network weavers out there on how we might be able to, leverage this network that we're building through all of you and the Food Systems Fridays episodes. So it's still a zygote of an idea, but I'm hoping that we can do a better job of, leveraging all the wonderful things that all of you are doing in the food systems, and see how we can connect you all, because you already share one thing in common, right? You're showing up on Fridays for Food Systems Fridays, and doing wonderful work in your own communities to help support sustainable food systems. So I hope that's enough of a lead for you. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you. And thank you very much, Michelle, for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Aw, rubbing it. Thank you.